Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Arguments Mapped. This episode we're going to be taking a look at the classic Christopher Hitchens versus John Lennox debate. This is the one debate that Hitch himself thought that he lost. Now obviously, Hitch wasn't convinced by Lennox to change his position, so that kind of gives you a bit of insight into the sophistry going on here to Hitchens, and I would be inclined to say Lennox as well. This is more of a semantic debate than an argumentative debate. And people don't look back fondly on this whole era of arguments, specifically on like the four new atheist types, which is Dennett, Hitchens, Harris, and Dawkins. And they're all kind of lumped together as being largely rhetoricians as opposed to actual argumentators. And they aren't looked at as having contributed much to the discourse. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through one of these debates, and we're going to map out the arguments as they're made. Now, I'm still kind of experimenting with like what I want the format to be, so I'm not quite sure how much of this video is going to be using examples from the video and how much is going to be summary. So just expect a little bit of both. And yeah, let's get into it. So we start off with the moderator introducing the two interlocutors in this debate. The moderator is Christopher Maitresse, if anyone's interested. And if you're wondering why I'm looking over here, I have a notes document that I'm taking notes in. And this is how he introduces the people. Christopher Hitchens, journalist, literary critic, and political commentator, author of 17 books at the time. And he had just put out his book, God Is Not Great, which is what inspired this debate with Lennox. And then he introduces John Lennox. He's the professor of mathematics at Oxford. He mentions that Lennox attended the last lectures of C.S. Lewis, which is actually a really interesting point. C.S. Lewis might be another interesting figure to map some of the arguments from at some point. And he mentions that a lot of people in the audience might know him from his debate with Richard Dawkins. And he mentions this debate with Dawkins as an example of cordial and productive debate, kind of like setting a standard. So I think that's interesting. We'll definitely go and check that debate out sometime. And then he goes on to outline the format of the debate. The format is going to be 15-minute introductions from each person. After the opening statements, they'll each have 10-minute rebuttals. And the order will be Hitchens, Lennox, Hitchens, Lennox. And then after that, there's like the audience questions, which are interesting, but I'm not going to go and map the stuff in the audience questions. So we're just going to be focused on the real meat of the debate here. And you can see here why I'm summarizing stuff, because if I would have played the video of him introducing this stuff, it would have added like 5 minutes. He does not mention in the intro to the debate a premise that they're going to be fighting over. Going off of the fact that Christopher Hitchens is starting and the title of the YouTube video, I'm going to assume that the key premise is going to be Christopher Hitchens asserting in the positive that God is not great. Again, God is great and God is not great would both be assertions. So really they're both making assertions here, because John Lennox isn't saying we must remain agnostic as to God's greatness. That would be the true neutral position. So they're both kind of making positive arguments and detracting from one another. Depending on how the arguments are laid out, it might be more helpful to map it like that. So we'll see as we go. All right, so before Hitchens really gets into it, he starts off by making reference to a novel. I believe it was called When It Was Dark, a novel that came out around the time of the First World War. And essentially in this novel, what happens is in Palestine, they find the corpse of Jesus Christ in a unopened tomb. So essentially the notion there is he didn't actually rise from the grave, you know, the body was still in the tomb, and then all systems of morality just dissolve, because if there is no God in the novel, there is no morality. So the novel goes on to talk about all the vain ways in which people are acting because they've lost belief in their God due to the uncovering of what is apparently Jesus's corpse. And then the novel ends by it being revealed that the whole Jesus's corpse being found thing was essentially a scam. It was a stunt put on by bad actors who wanted it to be the case that God wasn't real, and then the world goes back to being moral again. So Hitchens just says that this is not the case. He says that if it's exposed that one of our 3 Abrahamic religions, he doesn't say Abrahamic, but he says 3 religions, so he's talking about the West, really. He's not talking about Eastern religions. If one of our 3 religions is completely disproven, beyond any doubt, reasonable or unreasonable, that morality would remain exactly the same, that our human struggles with morality would stay the same. So he doesn't really make an argument for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add this, not as 1.1. 1.1 is going to be the main claim. I'm just going to add this as a claim. It's going to be 2, just because I'm going to reserve 1 for the ultimate conclusion. So I'm going to write this as, if God were disproven, our moral struggles would be exactly the same. I'm just going to leave this over here. And if he uses this, we can tie it into the argument. Otherwise, we're just going to leave it as a claim. He then goes on to outline his agenda for his opening statement, and I think I'm going to play the clip for this. So here you go.
So I want to begin by clarifying why it is that I believe there is no such entity or person, and I want to go on to say why I'm relieved when I reflect that this is so, why I think it would be horrible if it were true, or otherwise.
So there you go. I mean, he's kind of just making a plain atheist argument here for why he doesn't believe in God, but then he says he's going to go and flesh out why he's happy that it's not true or whatever. So apparently this will be the God is not great that we're looking for. So I'm going to put everything in the same document here, but I'm going to have like 2 ultimate conclusions. So we're going to have his little God is not great here, and we're also going to have God does not exist here. God is not great is going to be claim 1. Just because that's like the central theme of the debate, or that is how the debate was advertised. And we're going to have his God does not exist over here, and we're just going to map everything that pertains to these. So Hitchens starts out by making the distinction between theism and deism, and he points to how many of the arguments used to justify theological belief are actually just arguments for deism and don't imply theism in any way. And he brings up Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs for the existence of God in this. And I have them all here. They're motion, efficient cause, possibility and necessity, gradation, and design. And these are all essentially variants of the cosmological argument. Like if we take a look at motion, this talks about how all bodies are either potentially in motion or actually in motion, and how nothing can be reduced to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Therefore, we must believe in some sort of first mover that was not moved by another. And all the arguments are pretty similar to that. Since we're doing argument mapping, it's important to point out a unspoken premise here, something that is necessary to get this argument off the ground, and that is that infinity isn't possible. It's the idea that any infinite regress is immediately invalid. And the reason I bring this up is because infinite regress is going to come into the conversation a lot here. So it's important to be familiar with the ideas. So if you haven't already caught on, what Hitchens is doing here is he's trying to preemptively dismantle John Lennox's argument before John Lennox makes the argument, because John Lennox usually works within like the cosmological argument most of the time. So he takes the argument design as an argument that posits a first creator, and he says that the belief in a first cause becomes an infinite regress, because then you have to ask who designed the designer, and then that just goes on forever. Who designed the designer that designed the designer? So already we can see there's an aversion to infinite regresses on both sides of the table here. We haven't heard from Lennox yet, but we've already seen a Christian perspective that uses the idea of an infinite regress and argues against the infinite regress. I think, even though I don't think we'll actually wind up using it, it's important to map Hitchens' objection to his oversimplified version of the argument from design. So here I have mapped his objection to his version of the argument from design. The argument design is as follows. There must be an uncaused cause, and that uncaused cause is what we call God. And Hitchens' objection is this is infinitely regressive and therefore invalid / doesn't do anything to solve the problem. Hitch doesn't bring it up here, but he often uses Occam's razor. And his aversion to this is most likely because of its infinite regress with a complication. So that's assuming a bit. I just wanted to put that out there. Occam's razor, by the way, is when you have 2 explanations, you would usually side with the simpler one. For the record, he does say that it's not actually possible to conclusively prove intelligent design wrong. He just points out that intelligent design is an argument for deism and not theism. So it's a very vague belief. Then he does something interesting. He says that he's going to grant, for the sake of the debate, the deist argument that there is an unmoved mover. And he says that this still leaves the theist with all their work ahead of them, because they have to claim to have a way to know the mind of God, to a thorough degree as well. He goes on to list, like, a bunch of mitzvot. He makes the assertion that we are not in a position to know the mind of God. So we're actually going to go and map this as well. This is working towards his God does not exist. And I'm actually going to add in parentheses, the Christian God does not exist. So let's take a look. I have it all mapped here. We have the ultimate conclusion, which is the Christian God does not exist. And then we have two dependent reasons supporting that ultimate conclusion, which is to assert the Christian God exists, we must be able to know the mind of God. And we are not in a position to know the mind of God. So we'll leave it with that. He then says something noteworthy, but not really part of the argument. He goes on to say that atheism doesn't really need a word because it's not much of a belief system. It's kind of a non-belief system. Etymologically speaking, he's correct. Atheism is just not theism. It's just a lack of a belief. But he does sometimes conflate atheism with anti-theism, which is the belief that a God doesn't exist, which is an argument in the positive and therefore is a belief system. So you have to be careful with that stuff. He then talks about how he can give a list of things, what would be necessary to convert him to a theist. And he can give falsification conditions for his belief. And he says that theists don't do that. Now, maybe this is part of something. We're going to write out this claim just in case Lennox attacks it. Here it is. I've got it over here. Theists do not present falsification conditions that would make them change their beliefs. So that is one of Hitchens' assertions. He then makes another interesting statement, which we're going to map right now just in case it gets used again. So he says that theists tend to think that they're humble, tend to think of themselves as humble. But he says that is not the case. What we have here, theists are not humble. And he says that this is not the case because theists believe they are the central object of the universe. And we're going to have as a dependent claim that it is not humble to see oneself as the central object of the universe. Basically saying that this is a kind of main character syndrome. So we're going to put this down here and we'll move on. So now we finally get to a little bit of stuff that actually gets close to the ultimate conclusion here. So Hitch kind of sets the stage by talking about how with the most conservative estimates in the scientific field, humans have been around for 100,000 years. And he points out that the heavens have watched 98% of those years with indifference, while humans lived in, by today's standards, horrible conditions, lived essentially in terror. And then he kind of mockingly jabs that God decided, well, what we're going to do to intervene is we're going to make a man get tortured to death in the Middle East. The notion is that this is absurd. He doesn't explicitly say it, but it's very much that this is absurd. He says things like theists want to convict God of being a crummy designer, which is kind of funny. So let's actually map some of this stuff. Now it's difficult to tell whether he's using that absurdity against God existing or against God being good. I lean more towards the latter, since he's really emphasizing things that have strong moral implications, such as leaving humans in suffering for so long. So we're going to put it under here. All right, so I have this argument mapped. Let's take a look at this. We have God is not great as the ultimate conclusion. Oop, I should really number these. Okay, now I've got them numbered. So we have two dependent reasons supporting the ultimate conclusion. God watched for around 100,000 years as humans suffered greatly before intervening. And there is an implied notion. Again, so he doesn't say this. I should take this time to say that implicit claims will show up like this. And then supporting that God watched for over 100,000 years as humans suffered greatly before intervening is humans have existed for over 100,000 years. And yeah, that's the crux of this, essentially. Just for fun, we can also map the God as a crummy creator. And the reasons that Hitchens uses to support this is basically everything died. Everything died, and humans do a lot of bad stuff. I keep forgetting the number. There we go. Most animals have gone extinct, and humans are often evil, supporting God as a crummy creator. Really not an important argument here, but you can kind of see what he's doing. He's kind of just laying down breadcrumbs, and he wants Lennox to attack these things rather than the ultimate conclusion, in my opinion. In my view, taking a look at everything that we have so far, most of the stuff over here is bait to me. All right, so now we get to Lennox, and Lennox doesn't really fall for the breadcrumbs that Hitchens has laid out here. He goes straight to the ultimate conclusion, and he says right away that he draws a distinction between the evils that man has committed in the name of God and the greatness of God himself. And he says that Hitchens is trying to paint science and religion as things that can't work together, mutually exclusive. when Lennox is saying, he says that they are complementary explanations. And he talks about famous Christian scientists who didn't abandon their faith. He says that people like Kepler, Copernicus, and Galileo only discovered what they discovered because they were driven by their belief to discover these things. And he says that their faith was the reason for them believing in the first place that the universe is intelligible and discernible to the human mind. He also makes an interesting point that no matter how much we understand about causation, we can't explain why there is a universe in the first place. So let's take a look at the argument map, and let's see if any of this stuff works directly as a rebuttal. Not really, but he's objecting to something that Hitchens has said before. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to map that as an implicit. Now, since this isn't actually something that Hitchens says, we're going to leave this detached for now, because this is supposed to be Hitchens' argument with Lennox's detractions. So we'll map it like this. Lennox is taking the common objection that God is evil because of the evils committed in his name, and he is saying the greatness of God and the evils of man, and the evils man has committed in his name are not the same thing. He also then goes on to talk about something that Christopher Hitchens has said elsewhere, so we're actually going to throw this right into the mind map. He's responding to something that Hitchens has said, that if one must have faith to believe in something, then the probability of said thing being true is diminished. His objection is that science requires the faith that the universe can be understood by humans. And I guess the implicit thing there is science works. He also says that the rational explanation of science is given by the creator who designs not only the universe, but the human mind who studies it. I'm going to leave that as an aside, just in case it becomes important. So we're going to take this, and we're going to add it to the list of asides. So Lennox says quite a few things that could be taken as arguments, but I don't think he would like them formulated as arguments. And let me tell you why. So he says a lot of stuff like, science cannot explain why we are here, nor make aesthetic judgments. Essentially, he's saying that science is not capable of answering questions of meaning or morality. So he's making the is-ought distinction here. And he begs the question, how can Hitchens make a value judgment of God, that is saying that God is not great, if he doesn't believe in transcendental ethics? How can he make moral judgments without believing in transcendental morals? He actually brings up Nietzsche, Sartre, and Camus, and he calls them hard atheists. He kind of calls the existentialists hard atheists in believing that existence precedes essence. And he says that those three thinkers reinforce the idea that one cannot posit transcendental morals or values without a God. Which, when talking strictly about like transcendental morals and values, is quite true. For Nietzsche, you have the passages from Beyond Good and Evil about people creating their own values and taking advantage of their freedom. You have Sartre's We Are Condemned to be Free, which is essentially making a reference to that Nietzschean notion. And with Camus, you have One Must Imagine Sisyphus to be Happy, which is talking about being happy in the face of the lack of transcendental values. So we have an objection to God is not great. So how I have this mapped is as an objection to the main premise, God is not great. And I have three dependent reasons. So God is necessary for transcendental morals and values. Transcendental morals and values are good, and transcendental morals and values are necessary. So this is his three-pronged argument. And Lennox kind of closes out his argument by saying that belief in God gives people a sense of hope that he doesn't see in atheism. So I'll have it mapped like this. An objection to God is not great, being that God gives people a sense of hope. And I guess an implicit claim of that would be a sense of hope is good. So now we get to Hitchens' rebuttal. And he starts off by saying that Lennox is doing what he set Lennox up to do in his intro statement, which is that Lennox was claiming to know more than he can know. He restates that knowing the mind of God is not something that we humans are in the position to do, and he criticizes Lennox for invoking Einstein when Lennox was talking about how scientists need to have faith that the universe is discernible. That was something that Einstein had talked about a few times. And Hitchens criticizes Lennox for invoking Einstein when Einstein was very much against any notion of organized religion. He then talks about how the Milky Way is on a crash course with the Andromeda Galaxy. We've known this for a while now. And I think this goes towards his God is a crummy creator argument, but nothing else really. So I have this mapped here. Supporting God as a crummy creator is God placed the galaxy that matters most on a crash course. When I say it matters most, of course, I'm talking about, from the Christian worldview. And then Hitchens kind of talks about, the inevitable heat death of the universe due to us accelerating rather than decelerating since the Big Bang. That seemed more towards an argument of God not existing, so I'll place it as a reason here. The universe is headed towards a heat death, and a universe that will have a heat death does not seem like something the Christian God would create. Now, we get past those arguments, which are kind of rough in my opinion, and we move on to what he said he would get to before, why he believes that God is not great. So here are some direct reasons he has for that, and we're actually going to start by creating a new argument here. You have God can convict you of thought crimes, and the existence of God means 24/7 surveillance, and he uses these two to say that God's existence is an Orwellian dictatorship. All right, so here's what I just meant. We have God can convict you of thought crimes. The existence of God means 24/7 surveillance. These two taken together support God's existence as an Orwellian dictatorship. And then we have the implicit claim that Orwellian dictatorship is bad. And then we have his final bit before he finishes his rebuttal, which is something that he says quite a few places, which is, can you name one good thing that a theist can do that an atheist can't? And usually the response is, well, no. And then he says, can you name one bad thing that theists do that atheists don't? And then people will say things like jihads. So this is another supporting reason, and this is the claim that God permits people to do evils otherwise undoable. Now we'll get into Lennox's rebuttal. All right, so Lennox in his rebuttal starts out by saying that Hitchens misunderstood him when he was bringing up Einstein. He affirms that Einstein's faith was completely without reference to God. And here's a really interesting part. He criticizes Hitchens' inability to believe in the eternal. He says that's why Hitchens criticizes the infinite regress. So Lennox says that he believes in an uncreated God, as do most Christians. He points out that the idea of believing in a created God or a God created by another God is just not the common belief that Christians have. And he says that because Hitchens is going to critiquing an infinite regress, he can't comprehend or he doesn't agree with the idea of something that is eternal. Lennox brings up as evidence for something that is eternal the conservation of energy. And the reason that he brings this up is because energy is always conserved. There's never a change in the amount of energy in the universe. He also says that Hitchens' critique of the absurd notion of the heat death of the universe doesn't really matter as much to him. In fact, it makes sense to him, because Lennox says that from the New Testament, he gleans that this universe is finite, it is not eternal, and therefore an end of the universe doesn't bother him as much. He says that Hitchens needs to support his claim that one cannot know the mind of God. Actually, let's map that. So his objection to Hitchens' objection on the basis of an infinite regress would be right here, and this would be an objection to an objection, and this is Lennox's objection to Hitchens' objection. Lennox is saying that God is eternal and is not caused. We can actually take Lennox saying that the absurdity of the world doesn't bother him as much as a rebuttal to this claim right here. God placed the galaxy that matters most on a crash course supporting God as a karmic creator. I'll read it like this. There will be something new. This universe is not all that is. We then get to Lennox's critique of Hitchens' assertion that one cannot know the mind of God. He says that revelation is God becoming knowable. We then get to Lennox addressing Hitchens' idea of Christians being not humble, theists being not humble, sorry. And this isn't really interacting with Hitchens' reasoning, rather this is an aside. And his rebuttal is Christians just believe that which is revealed to them, which is not arrogant. We then get a few more arguments for the goodness of God. So we'll just say God is loving and good. He also has his objection to the notion of God being Orwellian. This is the first and only objection to a line of reasoning. So he's not objecting to either of these premises. He's not objecting to the notion of God convicting you of thought crimes or the existence of God meaning for surveillance. He says that this is cherry picking and misrepresentation, essentially. He says that the other parts of God do not fit into an Orwellian model of dictatorship. He's essentially saying that Hitchens wouldn't say that Big Brother is doing what it does because it loves you, and that's a crucial difference. And yeah, so that is the whole debate mapped. Let's zoom out and see all the argumentation we got in this debate. So as you can see on the core premise, on the ultimate conclusion here, rather than long lines of reasoning, what we have here is like a slew of reasons for and a slew of reasons against. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to arrange these trees from smallest to largest, and we're going to do a quick review of the arguments that we had here as a whole. So starting all the way over at the left, we have theists do not provide falsification conditions that would make them change their beliefs. This was a breadcrumb, really, by Hitchens, something that Lennox, as you can see, did not bite on, because there is no argumentation over this point. Another thing that Hitchens said, if God were disproven, our moral struggles would be exactly the same. I feel like after watching this debate, it's pretty clear that Lennox and Hitchens were talking past each other on morality, although I do feel like Lennox clearly articulated that he was talking about transcendent values, and Hitchens either didn't pick up on that or chose to ignore it. So when Hitchens says this, he's not talking about transcendental values. But obviously, we didn't really get the discourse that I thought would have been nice on this topic. We have a point that Hitchens didn't make that Lennox was kind of inferring from a common atheist perspective is God is evil because of the evils committed in his name. Lennox says the greatness of God and the evils man is committed in his name are not the same thing. If you want to be technical about it, this is a really good objection in my opinion, because other people's actions don't directly say something about your character, or at least they don't confirm it, you know. We have Lennox's claim that there must be an uncaused cause, and that uncaused cause is what we call God, which Hitchens criticizes as being infinitely regressive and therefore invalid. And Lennox criticizes that as saying that God is eternal, not caused. This point also kind of feels like them talking past each other a little bit, just because most atheists probably understand that Christians believe in an eternal notion of God. And just like most Christians probably understand that the atheist is not going to grant something eternal. Not a super productive exchange on that one. We have, if one must have faith or believe in something, then the probability of said thing being true is diminished. This is something that Hitchens said elsewhere, but since he said it, I'm not going to have it as an implied claim. And Lennox's objection is science requires the faith that the universe can be understood by humans, and science works. So this is kind of like saying that science is true, and that would invalidate this, or at least make it a strange claim. Science being true doesn't necessarily mean that the probability of it being true isn't diminished. It's just, it doesn't logically really parse. And then we have the one breadcrumb that I think Lennox did bite, which is that theists are not humble. So Hitch's argument is that theists believe that they are the central object of the universe, meaning humanity is the central object of the universe. And what's implied is it is not humble to see oneself as the central object of the universe. And Lennox's objection is that Christians just believe that which is revealed to them, which is not arrogant. I honestly think for any productive discussion to be had on this topic, the notion of humility would need to be extremely fleshed out before you go into it, just because the vague notion of being humble isn't something that lends itself well to a more logical debate. Oh, I forgot about this. This is kind of an aside, but kind of not. It's the God is a crummy creator, which is kind of being used as an argument against God's existence, but really not. Either way, it doesn't touch the ultimate conclusion. But we have Hitchens saying that most animals have gone extinct, and humans are often evil, and God placed the galaxy that matters most on a crash course, and he says that that looks like a bad creation job. And Lennox's objection to this point is that there will be something new, this universe is not all that is, kind of that, yes, it was planned to be this way, affirming that this universe is finite. Now we get to the second largest argument in the debate, which is that does the Christian God exist? Here are Hitch's two lines of reasoning. He says, to assert the Christian God exists, we must be able to know the mind of God, and we are not in a position to know the mind of God. And Lennox's objection is to claim 5, that we are not in a position to know the mind of God. He says that revelation is God becoming knowable. So he's saying Hitchens has kind of missed the point here. Hitch's other line of reasoning is that the universe is headed towards a heat death, and a universe that will have a heat death does not seem like something the Christian God would create. This is implicit, sorry. And Lennox objects to the implicit claim by saying that this is wrong because the New Testament reveals that the world is finite. And we have the ultimate argument, Just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to assume that great and good are essentially the same thing. So let's start out with Hitchens' argument. So we have the premise that humans have existed for over 100,000 years. Seeing that Lennox granted that, the creationists are getting no flowers in this debate. This is supporting the notion that God watched for around 100,000 years as humans suffered greatly before intervening, and the implicit claim here is that a God this indifferent is not great. And there were no critiques on this claim as far as I could see. So Hitch got away with this line of reasoning, and then we'll cover Lennox's objections after covering the arguments and the positives. Two things that were agreed upon: God can convict you of thought crimes, and the existence of God means 24/7 surveillance. And this is being used to say that God's existence is an Orwellian dictatorship. But Lennox is saying that this is cherry picking. Again, I don't think I notated this quite right. It's an objection to the inference. It's saying that these two things alone do not get you to that because the facts are being cherry picked. But anyways, Hitchens uses this to say that God's existence is an Orwellian dictatorship, and it's implied that Orwellian dictatorship is bad, which Lennox agrees with, so it is here that the contention is. We have something over here that was kind of touched by Lennox earlier. Hitchens says that God permits people to do evils otherwise undoable, or things that they wouldn't do, kind of. He's very slippery with this. And even though I didn't write it down here, you could take what Lennox said earlier. The reason it wasn't marked as an objection, by the way, is because he actually said this before Hitchens made this argument. That being Lennox's objection to the greatness of God and the evils of man being the same thing. He says that they are not the same thing. I will actually write this as an objection. There we go. I think this more accurately summarizes it. Now let's take a look at Lennox's objections just to the ultimate conclusion directly. Lennox says that God is loving and good. Though there were no rebuttals to this point, a lot of the stuff that Hitchens said could be taken as a rebuttal to this point, even though he said it like before Lennox even made this point. We also have God gives people a sense of hope, and the implied premise there is a sense of hope is good, objecting to God is not great. And then we have God is necessary for transcendental morals and values. And then implied are two things: transcendental morals and values are good, and transcendental morals and values are necessary. And that, all in all, is that is the argument altogether. I will say, in review, I don't think this contributed really anything to the discourse, if I'm being very honest. Both Hitchens and Lennox are very good public speakers. Hitchens is kind of unnecessarily mean in this debate. You kind of feel bad for poor old Lennox. And I can see why Hitchens said it was one of his worst debates, because even the sophistry wasn't really working here. So yeah, that's going to be the whole of the first arguments mapped video. Please give me any feedback, really, positive, negative, I would appreciate it. Some thoughts on the format would be nice. Do you want more videos? Do you want it to be all summary? Should I give more time to trying to wiggle things that aren't necessarily part of the argument into the argument? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.